What's up, everyone? It's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit like and subscribe and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, take a moment to quickly drop a comment saying where you're listening from, or just drop a quick comment saying that you're doing your part. Yeah, just like the meme. Now, with that said, enjoy this compilation, and as always, I've got lots of fresh content coming soon. The term golden years is meant to evoke a sense of peace, a well-earned reward of quiet comfort after a long life. It's a time for front porches, familiar neighbors, relaxing with family, and the safety of home. But between 1990 and 1996, in the historic West End of Richmond, Virginia, that promise was shattered. For at least 13 elderly women, their golden years became a season of unimaginable terror. Their homes transformed from sanctuaries into mortuaries. This is the story of the Golden Years slayings, and a horror which began on July 1st, 1990, when 89-year-old Mabel Venable was found cut down inside her house. It was a brutal, shocking crime that served as a dark omen of the 6-year nightmare to come. Following the slaying of Mabel Venable, a chilling and specific pattern began to emerge. Over the next 2 years, 5 more elderly women were eliminated in their homes, each attack bearing the same terrifying signature. The victims were all Black women, ranging in age from 61 to 85, who lived by themselves. The list of the dead grew steadily. 80-year-old Eva Jones and 61-year-old Mary Coffey in October 1990, 61-year-old Robinette Mickleberry in May 1991, 85-year-old Pearl Gash in December 1991, and finally, 81-year-old Martha Bolden in May 1992. The method in each of these first 6 attacks was consistent and brutal. The women were stabbed. This consistent modus operandi suggested a single predator was at work, a perpetrator with a clear and horrifying preference for a specific type of victim. The community was paralyzed by a unique kind of fear that can only be evoked from violating the home. Then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. For 2 years, an uneasy silence settled over Richmond's West End. Residents wondered if the predator had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply moved on. But the monster hadn't vanished. It was merely dormant, and when it re-emerged, it would be terrifyingly different. On August 16, 1994, the uneasy peace was broken with the slaying of 59-year-old Phyllis Harris. The terror was back, but the perpetrator's signature had completely changed. The new victims, beginning with Harris, were all white women. Even more jarring was the change in method. He now preferred strangulation. After the slaying of 82-year-old Inez J. Childress in September 1994, the attacker once again went dormant for a time. Unfortunately, he would be back in 1996 to unleash a final terrifying onslaught. 5 women were slain in just 4 months. Lucille Boyd, 75, in January, Gertrude Gardner, 77, in February, Mamie Harris Verlander, 84, in March. Then, in the most brazen set of attacks, there was Elizabeth Seibert, 69, and Jane Foster, 55, on consecutive days in April. The rapid succession of attacks sent a fresh wave of panic through the city. As the body count rose, Richmond transformed into a city under siege. The slayings provoked widespread outrage, not just because of their brutality, but because of the victims' profound vulnerability. Fear became a tangible part of daily life, especially for elderly women. Sales of weapons, door locks, and guard dogs surged as residents took security into their own hands, no longer trusting that they were safe in their own homes. In some neighborhoods, citizens' patrols were formed with police assistance, a clear sign that public faith in the authorities' ability to protect them was eroding. In 2000, 4 years after the last attack, a suspect finally emerged, but he was far from the criminal mastermind some might have imagined. Leslie Burchart was a 51-year-old homeless man with a long and documented history of severe mental illness, including a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Burchart was already in prison, serving a life sentence for confessing to the slaying of 3 homeless men in 1996. Then, in 1999, he contacted authorities and confessed to 4 of the Golden Years attacks. He admitted to having taken the lives of the last 4 victims: Lucille Boyd, Mamie Verlander, Elizabeth Seibert, and Jane Foster. His confession was stunningly detailed. He provided information about the crime scenes that was supposedly known only to investigators, making his claims seem highly credible. For a police department under immense pressure, it was the breakthrough they desperately needed. However, the confession was built on a foundation of sand. Burchart was a man known to suffer from hallucinations and hear voices. Some believe that he may have been purposely or inadvertently fed information during the confession process. Others suspect that he may have talked to someone in prison who actually committed the disturbing acts. Compounding the doubt, shortly before he died in prison from natural causes in 2002, he recanted his confession entirely and proclaimed his innocence. Due to the lack of any physical evidence connecting him to the crimes, Burchart was never formally tried, though he remains the prime and only significant suspect. With Leslie Burchart dead and no forensic evidence to provide clarity, the Golden Years slayings remain a puzzle with several competing solutions. The first theory is that a single serial perpetrator was responsible for all 13 deaths. This would require a psychological explanation for the dramatic shift in both method and victim race, a change that is highly unusual for serial predators. A second, more plausible theory suggests that Richmond was plagued by at least 2 separate monsters, whose crimes were mistakenly linked by police. This is the theory that I strongly prefer, because personally, I'm not seeing the strong connection to the 2 sets of attacks that the cops see. Under this scenario, one predator slew 6 elderly black women between 1990 and 1992 and then disappeared. 2 years later, a different attacker, perhaps Burchart, began strangling elderly white women in the same geographic area. The only common thread was the age of the victims and the fact they lived alone, which may have led to a critical case of confirmation bias by investigators. A third theory suggests that the entire investigation was essentially botched, and we can't really know what is true or what isn't. This theory stems from 2013 claims of a retired detective named Ron Reed, who worked on the case. Reed alleged that his supervisors forced him to suppress parts of Burchart's testimony, fearing that more negative publicity would destroy the department's reputation. The police department officially denied this, but did state that the other deaths Burchart allegedly confessed to were determined to have been from natural causes. For instance, Reed had tossed in the name of a woman who was known to have died of natural causes in 1996, while in a nursing home under round-the-clock care. Burchart readily provided details about how he slew the woman in her home. This allegation, if true, paints a picture of an investigation where controlling the public narrative may have taken precedence over uncovering the full truth. Decades later, the dust has never settled in Richmond. The Golden Years predator case remains officially unsolved. Leslie Burchart, the only person ever named as a suspect, will never face justice regardless, and it's unclear to what extent the cops continue to investigate the case. Whether this was one perpetrator or multiple perpetrators, the final injustice is the silence that continues to surround their deaths decades later. In the early months of 1912, a terrifying story of a voodoo-fueled rampage spread from Louisiana across the nation. At the heart of this story was a 19-year-old teenager named Clementine Barnabet. She was, the newspapers breathlessly reported, the self-proclaimed high priestess of a voodoo cult known as the Church of the Sacrifice. With eyes that were said to glare like those of a tigress, she confessed to a series of brutal axe attacks, not as crimes, but as holy acts for her cult. Despite being a teenage girl with a slight build, she explained that she received unholy strength from her sacrifices that allowed her to overpower strong adult men. These were strong men who were accustomed to hard physical labor their entire lives, allegedly overpowered by the occult forces of this purportedly spiritually powerful teenager. This image of the voodoo priestess, however, was as unstable as it was shocking. The story she told was like sand, shifting its shape with each retelling, and the details were lurid, but the actual facts were elusive. As the legend of Clementine Barnabet grew, a far more troubling question began to emerge from the shadows of her confession. Was she really a voodoo serial predator? Or was she a deeply disturbed young woman who became a convenient scapegoat for a real series of crimes plaguing the region? Interestingly, there will be one final twist at the end of this tale that makes modern scholars believe that even the contemporary legal system didn't fully believe her outlandish story. Between 1911 and 1912, a wave of unparalleled violence swept through the towns of southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas. The attacks were marked by a terrifyingly consistent and brutal modus operandi. Entire families, almost all of them African American, were slaughtered in their homes, with the attacks starting as they slept. The weapon was always an axe, often one taken from the victim's own woodshed. The attacker would slip into the house in the dead of night, commit the massacre, and disappear, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. Despite the attacks beginning while the victims were asleep, evidence from the scenes showed significant signs of resistance. The person or group doing this would, at certain points, have been fighting multiple people defending themselves in the dark. A disturbing geographical pattern soon became clear. The towns where the attacks occurred, Crowley, Lafayette, San Antonio, Lake Charles, Beaumont, were all connected by the steel ribbon of the Southern Pacific Railroad line. This suggested to investigators that the perpetrator was constantly on the move, riding the rails. The timeline of these massacres is essential to understanding the deep contradictions at the heart of the Clementine Barnabet case. While she would eventually confess to a staggering number of these crimes, the simple facts of her whereabouts cast profound doubt on her story. The slayings began long before her arrest, and most critically, continued with identical precision, even while she was securely locked behind bars. For 4 sets of attacks, where a total of 19 people had their lives taken, she was actually confirmed to be behind bars, despite having later confessed to these attacks in detail. The legal saga of Clementine Barnabet began not with her as the accused, but as the star witness against her own father. In October 1911, Raymond Barnabet was on trial for the slaying of the Andrus family, who had been their neighbors. Clementine took the stand and delivered damning testimony, swearing that her father had returned home on the night of the attacks, bragging that he eliminated his annoying neighbors. Importantly, he was said to have been covered in blood when he was bragging about this. Her brother, Zephyrin, corroborated her story, and he was convicted and sentenced to hang. This was despite the fact that numerous witnesses came forward in defense of Raymond, saying that none of what his kids said actually happened. Just 1 month later, in November 1911, another family, the Randalls, was massacred in Lafayette. With Raymond Barnabet in jail, suspicion immediately fell elsewhere. Authorities searched the room where Clementine was working as a live-in housekeeper and discovered something disturbing. It was a set of woman's clothing, but it had been drenched in blood. She was arrested, and after what, at a minimum, was a very harsh interrogation, she began to confess to everything. It was then that her story began its wild, untethered flight into infamy. Her confession was a constantly shifting narrative filled with lurid details that contradicted each other and the known facts of the crimes. At first, she was a member of a 5-person cult, drawing lots to decide who would commit the disturbing acts. They were led by a sinister voodoo priest, and Clementine's role wasn't one of leadership at that point in the confession. Later, the cult swelled to 105 members, with Clementine herself as the high priestess, where she distributed magical bags filled with voodoo charms made from her victims. She named accomplices who, when investigated, were found to be non-existent or had unshakable alibis. Most damningly, she proudly confessed to crimes that were verifiably committed while she was incarcerated. Her descriptions of the attacks were also often at odds with the physical evidence from the scenes themselves. She added lurid descriptions of dark rituals that were conducted, but despite leaving behind houses of horror, the axe attacker didn't leave behind any symbols like she described. Clementine's confession exhibits the classic hallmarks of what modern psychology recognizes as a coerced, internalized false confession. She was a young, impoverished, and completely uneducated woman, subjected to intense, high-pressure interrogation tactics. In this environment, some argue that the cops took on a role more similar to 16th century witch hunters than 20th century American police. When she was brought before a judge, the contemporary records make it look quite obvious that she was suffering from significant mental health issues. She laughed and rocked back and forth in the courtroom, which at the time was taken by some to indicate the truth of her confession. However, experts looking back on this now with modern eyes believe that this behavior appeared to be psychosis. The most glaring flaw in the case against Clementine Barnabet is also the most simple. The axe attacks didn't stop when she was arrested. This fact should have been the central piece of exculpatory evidence, proof that the real perpetrator was still at large. Instead, it was largely ignored, an inconvenient detail in a story that had already found its villain. Notably, this time period was characterized by other potential axe-wielding serial predators who rode the rails, leaving carnage in their wake. Many modern researchers and scholars believe that one of these individuals, rather than Clementine, was responsible for some of the very real string of crimes which occurred. However, even if this isn't the case, most theorists strongly believe that Clementine wasn't a voodoo high priestess, but rather an extremely mentally ill young woman. Faced with the complete force of the state coming down on her, she admitted everything she thought the investigators wanted to hear. Unsurprisingly, at her trial, Clementine Barnabet's attorney argued that she was insane, a defense supported by her bizarre behavior and outlandish claims. During the proceedings, she again confessed to every crime imaginable, and let the court know that a fiery chariot was going to come from the sky to save her. To those holding their breath, wondering if this chariot ever arrived, well, I have bad news for you. Despite this bizarre behavior and the arguments of her lawyer, she was found guilty of one of the attacks and sentenced to life in prison. Her story takes its final disturbing turn within the prison walls. After serving about 9 years, medical experts at the penitentiary decided to take drastic action. In a 1921 article, it was reported that prison surgeons performed an unspecified operation that they claimed restored her to normal condition. The exact nature of the surgery isn't certain, but it's heavily implied that it involved her brain in some way. Importantly, lobotomies weren't performed in America for another 15 years, so it appears the doctors performed an extreme experimental procedure on Clementine. Then things got even weirder, and by way of reminder, she wasn't found to be insane, she was found guilty of committing a slaying. On August 28, 1923, having been deemed cured of whatever her problem was, Clementine Barnabet was released from prison. Again, to emphasize how weird this was, she had been sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, and she hadn't been found to be legally insane at the time of the crime. Being found cured thus ought not to have been grounds for the release. But the Louisiana authorities just up and let her loose upon the world. At the age of 29 or 30, she walked out of the prison gates and into complete obscurity, and there are no further records of her life. Her subsequent activities, her whereabouts, and the date and circumstances of her death are entirely unknown. This supposed axe-wielding voodoo high priestess simply vanished, never to be heard from again. One of the most compelling speculative theories about the Clementine Barnabet case is that she may have been deliberately set up to take the blame for a real crime. The discovery of bloody clothing in her room, the most damning physical evidence used against her, could easily have been planted. Under this theory, someone understood both the chaos of the investigations into the attacks and Clementine's disturbed and fragile mental state. The individual responsible for framing her likely knew she was already viewed as unstable, impoverished, and vulnerable to coercion. By placing incriminating evidence in her possession, they guaranteed suspicion would fall squarely on her. Once the police found the blood-soaked garments, investigators seized upon Clementine as their perfect suspect. Her erratic behavior and clear signs of psychosis only reinforced the narrative that she was guilty, even when her confessions grew inconsistent and impossible. A manipulator with knowledge of her instability could predict that, under harsh interrogation, she'd quickly unravel and tell authorities exactly what they wanted to hear. Under this theory, Clementine became the convenient scapegoat, her life destroyed while the real predator continued to stalk the rail lines unchecked. Personally, I find Clementine's brother Zephyrin's behavior suspicious because he eagerly supported the case against their father. This was despite the fact that all other witnesses contradicted the testimony against him. It feels to me that Zephyrin could have been subtly manipulating her and feeding into her delusions while committing at least some of the crimes himself. That said, ultimately the investigation was completely flawed, so we'll never know the truth on this. The Bible John case refers to a series of 3 unsolved slayings of young women in Glasgow, Scotland, between 1968 and 1969. These crimes were all potentially carried out by the same seemingly religiously obsessed man. The victims were Patricia Docker, 25, Jemima MacDonald, 32, and Helen Puttock, 29. They were all mothers who had spent evenings at Glasgow's popular Barrowland Ballroom nightclub immediately before being slain. They were found beaten and strangled, and each woman was on her period at the time of death, a grim detail that later fueled theories about the perpetrator's motive. Patricia Docker, an auxiliary nurse, was the first known victim. On February 23, 1968, her body was found in a Glasgow alleyway near her home in the Battlefield district. Many of her personal belongings, including her clothing, handbag, and watch, were missing, suggesting the perp removed them from the scene. Initially, Docker's slaying received limited leads, and police struggled due to a lack of witnesses and physical evidence. Her parents had thought she went to a different dance hall that night, and it was over a week before a witness came forward to confirm seeing her at the Barrowland Ballroom. This fact led to a significant delay in the initial investigation, and the case went cold. In August 1969, a second attack re-energized the investigation. Jemima MacDonald, a 32-year-old mother of 3, spent the evening of Saturday, August 16th, 1969, dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. When she failed to return home, her sister grew concerned. Tragically, on August 18th, Jemima's body was discovered in an abandoned tenement building by her own sister after local children spoke of finding a body. Unlike Docker, she was found fully clothed, but investigators noted striking similarities between the two cases. Both women had spent their last evenings at the Barrowland, both were strangled, and were on their periods when slain. On October 31st, 1969, the body of Helen Puttock was found behind her Glasgow home, marking the third and final known act of this perpetrator. Helen, 29, had also visited the Barrowland Ballroom the night before, accompanied by her sister, Jean Langford. And keep Jean Langford in mind, because her evidence is going to be extremely important going forward in this case. They met two men at the dance hall who both called themselves John. After midnight, the group of four left together. One man departed earlier to catch a bus, and Helen and Jean shared a taxi with the other John. During the taxi ride, this well-spoken man revealed oddly intense views. He spoke disapprovingly of married women attending nightclubs and dance halls and referenced the Bible, repeatedly remarking on Old Testament punishments for adultery. Jean also remembered that he mentioned he didn't drink on New Year's Eve because he preferred to spend his time praying. These comments made a strong impression on Jean. The man insisted on dropping Jean off first, even though her home was farther, leaving him alone with Helen. It was the last time Jean saw her sister alive. The next morning, Helen Puttock was found in her backyard, partially clothed and brutally beaten. With the third slaying's obvious parallels to the others, a young mother attacked after a Barrowland night out. Police were convinced they faced a serial perpetrator. The manhunt for Bible John escalated rapidly after Helen was discovered. Jean Langford provided a detailed description of the suspect, a tall, slim, well-dressed man in his mid-20s with short, reddish-blonde hair and overlapping front teeth. Detectives widely distributed the drawing. Interestingly, they noted that his hairstyle was so unfashionable that a local barber may recognize the cut, and ended up showing it to almost 500 local barbers, with no leads. The investigation soon became one of the most intensive ever seen in Scotland. Over 100 detectives were assigned full-time, and more than 50,000 witness statements were taken. Additionally, thousands of potential suspects were questioned within the first year. Undercover officers even patrolled Glasgow dance halls, including the Barrowland, hoping Bible John might return to his hunting ground. Despite the massive manhunt and numerous tips, no arrest was made. By the early 1970s, the trail had gone cold. Some officers theorized that the unknown perpetrator might have died, been incarcerated for another crime, or that he may have been investigated and ruled out as a suspect. And trust me, you're going to want to keep that last point in the back of your mind. Others thought he may have simply left the area, perhaps explaining why the slaying stopped as suddenly as they began. With no further cases linked to Bible John, the case gradually moved into the realm of speculation. One early avenue of suspicion was that the slayings might not have been the work of a random predator at all, but rather the result of separate domestic crimes. In later reviews of the case, some detectives noted that both Patricia Docker and Jemima MacDonald had troubled marital histories. Docker was estranged from her husband Alex at the time of her death. The two were in the process of divorce, and Alex was on leave in Glasgow that week. He was an early suspect, as investigators learned he had a potential motive and even checked into a hotel with another woman the day after Patricia's slaying. This was seen as perhaps a celebratory measure taken by Alex Docker, though nothing could be proven. Likewise, Jemima MacDonald had recently separated from her husband and moved back to Glasgow. These connections led some within law enforcement to believe that at least two of the three Bible John cases might actually have been unrelated attacks by people known to the victims. Another suspect emerged years after the Bible John terror, John Irvine McInnes, a former soldier and a cousin of a very senior Glasgow police official. McInnes was never publicly named during the original inquiry, but a secret 1995 review of the case zeroed in on him as a potential Bible John. Detectives in that review suspected that McInnes might have been the unidentified man in the taxi with Helen Puttock. Further, they even suggested that the original lead investigator, Joe Beatty, deliberately steered attention away from McInnes because McInnes's cousin was his friend. In 1995, police obtained permission to exhume John McInnes's body. McInnes had reached his end voluntarily in 1980. Thankfully, despite the Bible John slayings having taken place in the late 1960s, all biological evidence was preserved. The results were inconclusive and the genetic sample did not match, nor definitively exclude, McInnes. Notably, in a 2022 BBC podcast, the detectives who re-examined the case in 1995 indicated that they would have arrested McInnes for the slaying of Helen Puttock if he had been alive still. Notably and somewhat oddly, despite incredible improvements in DNA analysis since the mid-90s, the evidence hasn't been retested as yet. That said, the involvement of McInnes remains a controversial theory. While McInnes fit many aspects of the profile, such as being from a strict religious background, Jean Langford couldn't identify him conclusively as the man from the cab. The most famous theory to emerge in modern times is the possible link between Bible John and convicted serial perpetrator Peter Tobin. Tobin, who was from Glasgow, was found guilty of 3 slayings between 1991 and 2006. In 2006, after Tobin's arrest, detectives launched Operation Anagram to retrace his life and see if he could be tied to other unsolved crimes. Several intriguing connections came to light. Tobin had lived in Glasgow in the late 1960s, not far from the Barrowland. He even married his first wife in August 1969 after meeting her at the Barrowland Ballroom itself in 1968. Now, to be fair, this isn't quite as odd as I initially thought it was, given that the venue has a capacity of almost 2,000 people. Further, he was known for his violent hatred towards women. All 3 of his former wives later described the already violent Tobin flying into a rage when they were on their periods. Investigators have long suspected the Bible John perpetrator targeted his victims during this time of the month. This behavioral parallel, along with reports that Tobin was deeply religious, supported this theory. Further, Tobin was known to use the alias John Semple. Jean Langford couldn't remember the last name Bible John gave exactly, but believed that it was Templeton. Investigators and theorists have noted that Semple sounds extremely close to Temple. However, there's no hard evidence linking Tobin to the Bible John slayings, and there's good evidence that he didn't do it. Going against the theory is the fact that Tobin moved to Brighton, England in early August 1969. His ex-wife has vehemently denied he could have slipped away to Glasgow to commit the final 2 horrendous acts. Furthermore, Tobin was 5'6", and Jean Langford had remembered Bible John being a notably tall individual. I think it's also important to note that Tobin and Bible John simply really don't bear any meaningful physical resemblance. Tobin has dark hair and dark eyes, while Bible John, even when seen in low light, was identified as having reddish blonde hair and blue eyes. Interestingly, some investigators who've worked on the Bible John case have commented on the strong internal disagreements in the investigation over Tobin being Bible John. That said, the anti-Tobin camp appears to have won out, with the Tobin theory now largely being confined to amateur theories rather than official theories. Personally, I think John McInnes needs yet another glance with modernized forensic techniques. It's important to remember that all 3 of the women were young mothers. the authorities may be able to bring significant closure to their now adult children by using these modern techniques. The Oklahoma City Butcher is the name given to an unidentified serial perpetrator believed to have slain 3 women in Oklahoma City between 1976 and 1986. This case stands out as one of the city's most chilling, unsolved mysteries, especially given the horrific nature of the acts which were perpetrated. All known victims were young, homeless Native American women, a fact that helped investigators link the crimes. The case first came to public attention on April 1st, 1976, when 3 workers inspecting an abandoned house on 6th Street in Oklahoma City made a horrifying discovery. Inside the dilapidated house, the men noticed a foul odor and stumbled upon a head hidden in a box. Police responding to the scene found that body parts were scattered throughout the house, and the victim's face had been given a Glasgow smile. If you've ever seen the show Sons of Anarchy, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. At the time, the victim couldn't be identified. With no immediate leads, this slaying gained some media attention initially, but soon faded from headlines. Investigators had little to go on. The victim was a young Native American woman, but her name remained unknown for years. It wasn't until 1993 that additional testing finally identified her as Kathy Lynn Shackelford, who had run away from home at 17. This belated identification gave some closure to her family, but came long after the trail for the perpetrator had gone cold. For 3 years, the 1976 act appeared to be a disturbed, isolated incident. Then, on April 19, 1979, another grisly discovery was made in a northeast Oklahoma City neighborhood. In a scene out of a horror film, people observed a dog dragging what turned out to be a head down the street, all in broad daylight. Police were alerted and over the next several days recovered more body parts of the victim scattered around the area, some wrapped in butcher paper or newspapers. Media reports at the time referred to the parts being wrapped up butcher shop style. Unlike the first case, this time authorities quickly identified the victim as 22-year-old Arlie Bell Killian via fingerprints. Killian was a young Native American woman known to have struggled with substance issues and homelessness. The community was terrified by the macabre scene that unfolded in their neighborhood. Residents grew anxious not knowing who could commit such a heinous act. Law enforcement launched an intensive investigation and even developed a couple of early suspects. One suspect was the victim's own brother, who had escaped from a mental hospital on the very day Arlie was slain. He had a violent history and had previously been arrested for slaughtering pets with a hatchet. Given this background and the uncanny timing of his escape, police initially considered him a strong suspect and subjected him to hours of questioning. However, as the investigation continued, doubts arose about the brother's involvement. Crucially, additional parts of Arlie's body kept appearing around the city, even after Arlie's brother had been taken into custody on April 24, 1979. These were in highly public areas, intended to specifically cause fear in the community. Arlie's brother was ultimately cleared as a suspect, with his escape coming to be seen as merely a very timely coincidence, and the second investigation hit a dead end. Importantly, and unfortunately, crucial initial investigative resources were ultimately wasted by going down this initially very promising rabbit hole. And that's not a criticism of the investigation whatsoever, especially given the timing of his escape and the brother's history of violence. Community concern led to public meetings of worried citizens, but with no new leads, the case went cold again in the following years. 7 years would pass before the butcher struck again, if indeed it was the same perpetrator, and this time the authorities would try to handle the 3 cases holistically. On March 6, 1986, a man in Oklahoma City found portions of a body behind his house. Police were called to collect the remains, and within a week yet another grim discovery was made: the victim's head was found in a nearby garbage bin nearby. In this case, the perp had attempted to destroy evidence by setting the remains on fire, leaving the head badly charred when found. Despite this, the victim was identified almost immediately as 22-year-old Tina Sanders. She had distinctive tattoos on her body, which helped authorities confirm her identity. Like the previous victims, Tina Sanders was a young Native American woman who was experiencing homelessness at the time. Witnesses reported she was last seen alive just one day before her remains were found. The extreme brutality and the familiar pattern clearly echoed the earlier unsolved cases. Within a few weeks, Oklahoma City police publicly announced that they believed all three slayings in 1976, 1979, and 1986 were linked to a single serial predator. Investigators noted the common signature in each crime. Notably, in a shocking twist, the police also revealed that in all cases the women had distinctive parts of their anatomy removed. These parts were never recovered, unlike the other body parts, leading to speculations as to why this additional cruelty was inflicted. It was also significant that all three victims shared a similar profile: young Native American women living transient lifestyles, which likely made them targets of opportunity. This was the first time authorities publicly used the moniker Oklahoma City Butcher for the perpetrator. The revelation that a serial perp had been operating, albeit infrequently, for a decade was shocking for the community, and initially significant investigative resources were assigned. Despite thorough investigations, however, no solid leads emerged after 1986. The cold case investigator who has led the file in recent years noted in an interview that he believed that this case could have been solved had it been given sustained significant attention at the time. However, he noted that because the women were homeless, Native American, and had been living on the outskirts of life, resources weren't properly allocated to the cases. Over the years, several theories and suspects have been proposed by law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and amateur sleuths, but none have been proven. One prominent theory in the 1980s was that the perpetrator might be Henry Lee Lucas, a drifter from Texas. Lucas was arrested in 1983 and became infamous for confessing to hundreds of crimes nationwide, most of which he didn't actually commit. During his confession spree, Lucas admitted to slaying Arlie Bell Killian, the 1979 victim, and so he was considered a serious suspect for a time. Oklahoma City investigators traveled to interview Lucas in prison, hoping his information would solve the case. However, as they probed deeper, it became evident that Lucas's story did not hold up, and he knew nothing about the case except what was in the public record. Further, he was incarcerated at the time of the third attack, which, if the theory that all three acts were committed by the same person is accurate, obviously discredits him. Given the methods employed by the perp and the use of actual butcher paper, some have speculated that the Oklahoma City butcher was, in fact, a literal butcher. Others have speculated he may have had medical or other sorts of anatomical training. One puzzling aspect of the case is the long gaps between the slayings. Roughly 3 years between the first and second, then a 7-year gap before the third. Such long cooling-off periods aren't typical for serial perpetrators, who often escalate or operate in closer intervals. This has led to theories that the Oklahoma City butcher might have been unable to attack during those years. Some have speculated that he may have been incarcerated for other crimes, or even serving in the military and stationed elsewhere. If, for example, the perpetrator was jailed in the early 1980s and released by the mid-1980s, that could explain why no acts occurred in that window. Alternatively, the individual might have simply left the area and then later returned. Another theory to explain the gaps suggests that he was perhaps a long-haul truck driver, though there's no direct evidence of this. However, circumstantial evidence suggests that he could have struck in other areas, meaning that the cooling off period issue isn't the factor it appears to be. Still, another theory suggests that the first two slayings are independent of the third, suggesting a copycat style attack. This is considered unlikely as many of the details of the 1976 and 1979 slayings weren't made public until after 1986. In the mid-1970s, an elusive serial perpetrator terrorized San Francisco's gay community, preying on men he met in night spots and earning the nickname the Doodler. Between early 1974 and late 1975, at least 5 men were brutally slain, and several others assaulted, by an unidentified assailant who would sketch his targets before attacking. The Doodler's known crime spree spanned roughly 18 months. The first victim was discovered in the early hours of January 27, 1974, when the body of 50-year-old Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was found on Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Kavanaugh had been stabbed multiple times and showed defensive wounds. His slaying initially drew very little public attention. A few months later, on June 25, 1974, the perpetrator struck again. Joseph Stevens was found deceased near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. Stevens had been seen at a club the night before, and police believed he left with the suspect and was slain shortly afterward. The violence continued into the summer of 1974 as panic set in across the city and in the targeted community. On July 7, 1974, the body of Klaus Christmann, a 31-year-old German immigrant, was discovered at Ocean Beach. Christmann was married and had children, and the authorities thought he might have been closeted given the era's social climate. By this point, investigators began to suspect a pattern. The similar modus operandi and victim profile prompted police to link the cases. After a brief lull in the latter half of 1974, the perpetrator struck several more times in 1975. On April 27, 1975, 52-year-old Warren Andrews, a lawyer, was assaulted at Land's End, a coastal park not far from the prior Ocean Beach crime scenes. Andrews was bludgeoned with a rock and branch rather than stabbed, and he never regained consciousness, dying weeks later from his injuries. Notably, Warren Andrews was only connected to the Doodler by the authorities in 2022. This recent revelation suggests that there may be even more crimes linked to the Doodler than are publicly known. Just 2 weeks after the Andrews attack, on May 12, 1975, the body of Frederick Elmer Capon, 32, was found on Ocean Beach. Like the others, Capon had been stabbed in the torso, and evidence at the scene suggested his body had been dragged roughly 20 feet, indicating an attempt to conceal the crime. Capon, a Vietnam War veteran and nurse, was identified via fingerprints. The final known victim, Harold Goldberg, 66, was discovered on June 4, 1975 in Lincoln Park. He was discovered in a state of advanced decomposition. Notably, there has been some controversy as to whether Goldberg was a victim of the Doodler, given that he was substantially older than the other men who were slain. In addition to these acts, at least 3 men survived attacks believed to be by the Doodler. And what you're about to hear is extremely unfortunate, as it's proof positive that there was enough evidence to bring this monster to justice, at least at a certain point. In July 1975, within 2 weeks of each other, 2 different men were stabbed in the Fox Plaza area of San Francisco, but managed to survive. One of them later told police he encountered the assailant late at night in a diner that was known to be a gay-friendly hangout by locals. The man had been sketching animal figures on a napkin and claimed to be an art student studying to be a cartoonist. This charming approach, offering a drawing and engaging in conversation, was likely how the perp gained the trust of his victims. The tactic proved tragically effective at luring men to isolated spots. Another survivor in October 1975 spent considerable time with the suspect and provided detectives with a detailed description. These first-hand accounts allowed police to create a composite sketch of the attacker, depicting a young black man with a slender build. From the beginning, the Doodler investigation was hampered by the social climate of the time and the elusive nature of the perpetrator. After the early slayings in 1974, San Francisco police noted the commonalities and realized a single offender might be responsible. The surviving victim's testimony in 1975 was a major break. Their information yielded a police composite sketch in 1975, which was circulated to help identify the suspect. Tips poured in. One anonymous caller even provided a name and a license plate number that pointed to a potential suspect. Acting on these leads, SFPD detectives identified a strong suspect and brought him in for an interview in January 1976. This individual was a young man fitting the description, an African-American male in his early 20s, around 5'11" with a lanky build. By then, however, the string of known Doodler assaults had stopped, and investigators faced a critical hurdle. That is to say, lack of cooperation from key witnesses. Several men had survived encounters with the Doodler, including the two from summer 1975 and one other earlier victim, but none were willing to publicly testify against the suspect. In the 1970s, coming out as a gay man carried immense stigma and personal risk. According to a 1977 report, 2 of the 3 survivors were prominent individuals. One of them was described as, quote, a well-known entertainer, while another was described as a prominent diplomat. Without their testimony, prosecutors had no strong case, since physical evidence linking the suspect to the crimes was scant. The suspect himself cooperated with a police interview but denied committing the acts, and with no willing witnesses and no confession, authorities had to release him. Investigators were convinced they had the right man. One officer later said they strongly believed the detained individual was indeed the Doodler. Decades later, in an effort to reignite the case, San Francisco police artists used this to quote-unquote hypothesize how the Doodler might look as a much older man. And given what we know, and what the police appear to know, I really have to believe this image must be quite exact. The updated rendering was released to the public, reflecting the suspect in his 60s or 70s. Authorities hoped that modern eyes might recognize the face after so many years, and that someone might finally be willing to speak up with information. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement faced numerous challenges beyond uncooperative witnesses. The crimes occurred in an era when forensic technology was limited, DNA profiling didn't exist, and other physical evidence was often not enough to conclusively tie a suspect to a crime, at least to the exacting standards required by our legal system. In one intriguing twist, a psychiatrist contacted police in late 1975, claiming that one of his patients had confessed to being the Doodler. This doctor, known only by the pseudonym Dr. Priest, after the practice of confession, even gave a name to investigators, seemingly corroborating the suspect they had in mind. Yet, because the survivors refused to identify the suspect in court, and the alleged confession came through a second-hand source bound by medical confidentiality, the case didn't progress. By the end of the 1970s, the Doodler investigation had gone cold, despite an array of extremely promising leads that never fully materialized into a resolvable case. It's chilling to note that after the police sketch was publicized and a suspect was interviewed, the Doodler stopped his attacks. This suggested that the person responsible was scared by the heat, and also strongly suggests that the interviewed party was the Doodler. Given the evidence gathered, police and crime experts have formed theories about who the Doodler might be, and what drove him to commit this series of heinous acts. The leading theory is that the unnamed man detained in 1976 was indeed the perpetrator. Investigators have quietly kept tabs on this individual over the years. In fact, he remains a person of interest decades later. As of the early 2020s, SFPD confirmed they have re-interviewed the same man and that he is still under suspicion, though he has not been publicly named at present. The man is believed to be living in California's East Bay region and would likely be in his early 70s based on the evidence that's been released. Officially, no charges have ever been filed, but the consensus among those familiar with the case is that authorities have something just shy of certainty as to who the doodler is. And this isn't one of those cases where authorities have a strong inkling. They really seem to have near absolute confirmation as to who the guy actually is. This is a case where we have multiple high-profile people who were unwilling to testify against him due to personal concerns about their orientation coming out in open court. Combine this with the fact that a psychiatrist came forward to advise that the doodler himself confessed, and well, there's a real evidentiary quagmire. All of these parties provided independent confirmation that the doodler was the same person, but due to an unwillingness to testify and medical confidentiality, the authorities have their hands tied. Another important question is, what exactly would drive someone to commit these sick crimes? Both professional criminal profilers and online sleuths have noted that the doodler's pattern suggests a complex and conflicted motive. All evidence indicates that the doodler engaged in relationships with the men before ending them. Some have speculated that the perpetrator might have been grappling with his own identity, and that attempting to repress his identity led to a horrific outbreak in serial violence. Another theory about the doodler's motive is rooted in the social shame of the time. It's important to remember that even in San Francisco in the 1970s, the police had an extremely strained relationship with the gay community. This community had faced decades of abuse at the hands of the authorities. In general, at best, the community was wary of the police. Since all known victims were part of the community, even if only on a closeted basis, the perpetrator may have chose to operate in a community reluctant to engage with law enforcement. Some investigators theorize he deliberately targeted men who, he assumed, would be reluctant to report attacks. This could point to a predator who cynically took advantage of society's bias. Unfortunately, I have some doubts about whether the doodler will ever be brought to justice, and this fact is made more concerning by the fact that he is likely still alive. At present, given that the doodler is subject to an active and ongoing investigation, it's unclear if his DNA evidence has been logged. However, given that the suspect has been re-interviewed in recent years, I suspect this isn't the case. At present, the most realistic chance appears to be having the authorities lean on one of the witnesses who survived their encounters with this monster. If any of these three men are still alive, they likely hold the only remaining keys to realistically cracking these cases and bringing justice for the victims. Also, as I was editing, I realized why the doodler likely never struck again. I suspect that given the strength of the evidence against him, the SFPD has likely had this guy under intermittent surveillance for the last half-century. The Eastbound Strangler refers to an unidentified serial offender believed to have slain 4 women near Atlantic City, New Jersey in late 2006. The case gets its name from the fact that each victim was found with her head facing east, towards Atlantic City. On November 20th, 2006, 2 women walking near a desolate stretch outside Atlantic City made a grim discovery. They stumbled upon the body of 35-year-old Kim Raffo lying face down in a drainage ditch behind the Golden Key Motel in West Atlantic City. The area around this shallow runoff ditch was a known hangout in a seedy area on the outskirts of the city. When police arrived at the scene, they quickly found 3 more bodies in the same ditch, all within about 50 yards of Raffo's remains. The 4 victims were found fully clothed, except for their shoes and socks, and lying face down in a row, all with their heads oddly turned toward the east. The victims were eventually identified as 4 women who had been involved in paid companionship work in the Atlantic City area. Each had fallen on hard times before their deaths, and all were mothers struggling with personal issues. Barbara Brador, 42, was last seen in October 2006. She was known to have battled multiple substance addictions. By the time her body was found, it was badly decomposed, and investigators could not determine an exact cause of death. Molly Jean Dilts was 20 years old, and originally from Pennsylvania. Dilts was fairly new to Atlantic City. She was the only victim without a known record of SW, though police believe she had recently entered that life. She is thought to have been the first slain, and her remains were so decomposed that her cause of death could not be determined. Kim Raffo, 35, was a former waitress from Brooklyn, New York. Raffo had moved to Atlantic City in 2003 and struggled with substance addiction. She was seen alive just one day before the bodies were discovered. Raffo is strongly believed to have been the last of the 4 victims to die, and unlike the others, her cause of death was clear. She had been strangled with a rope or cord. Tracy Ann Roberts, 23, was a former dancer from Delaware who had only moved to Atlantic City within the past year. In the weeks before her death, she survived an assault by a man who tried to get her to work for him in an illicit capacity. It's unclear whether there's any connection between this event and her subsequent slaying, though the authorities generally don't believe so. Her body showed signs of asphyxiation, indicating she was likely strangled by the perpetrator. All 4 women were found barefoot, with their feet pointing up against the bank of the ditch. Investigators believe the man removed their shoes and used the position of their feet to anchor the bodies in place so they wouldn't wash away in the water. The eerie arrangement of the victims immediately signaled to police that this was a serial crime scene rather than a dumping ground used by multiple perps. The discovery of 4 slain women just outside a major tourist destination sent shockwaves through the community. In the immediate aftermath, the case commanded intense attention. Over 100 detectives, local and state, were assigned to work on the investigation, and national media descended on Atlantic City. Authorities quickly confirmed that the 4 acts almost certainly met the FBI's definition of a serial offender case. Several persons of interest did emerge in the investigation, though none have been charged, nor have any been definitively linked to the case. One of the first was Terry Olson, a 41-year-old handyman from southern New Jersey. Olson was living at the rundown Golden Key Motel, near where the bodies were found. At the time of the slayings, he was staying in a room free of charge in exchange for doing odd jobs and maintenance work around the property. Shortly after news broke, Olson's girlfriend, with whom he was having a bad breakup, called police and pointed to him as a possible perpetrator. Detectives brought Olson in for hours of intense questioning. A search of his living space turned up tapes that contained disturbing hidden footage of his girlfriend's teenage daughter, for which he was ultimately charged. This discovery made Olson look more suspicious, but crucially, when he provided DNA samples, none of his DNA matched any evidence from the victims. Investigators never found anything directly tying him to the slayings, and Olson was eventually released and is no longer considered a suspect. Another name that surfaced was Eldred Raymond Burchell, a transient man who had nicknamed himself the River Man, in reference to the infamous Gary Ridgway. A local worker, Denise Hill, told police that Burchell spent time with her around 2006 and allegedly confessed to having slain women. Burchell was indeed in Atlantic City during the period the acts took place, but when police attempted to locate him for questioning, he had vanished. His whereabouts remain unknown, and authorities found no hard evidence linking him to the 4 victims aside from the second-hand claim. Like Olson, Burchell has never been formally charged in connection with the case and has never officially been named a suspect. Investigators also interviewed at least 2 other local men who knew one or more of the victims, but they too were released without charge. To date, no current suspect has been publicly named, and no arrests have ever been made in the Eastbound Strangler case. Over time, several theories have emerged about the identity and motive of the Eastbound Strangler. One of the most widely discussed ideas was a possible connection to the notorious Long Island serial slayer case. The case involved a series of slayings of workers whose remains were found on Gilgo Beach in Long Island from 2010 onwards. Theorists noted the similarities: multiple female victims, all involved in the same type of work, with their bodies dumped in a coastal area. In late 2010, New Jersey and New York authorities did investigate a possible link between the 2 cases. However, they found no evidence to tie the crimes together and ultimately ruled out any connection at that time. The theory resurfaced in 2023 when a suspect was arrested in the Long Island case. Once again, officials compared details and affirmed that there was no link between the 2 cases. Given that DNA evidence is available in both cases, I have to assume that the DNA evidence simply didn't add up. Another persistent question is why the act stopped after that cluster of 4 in fall 2006. Serial perps typically continue until caught, so the sudden halt in known victims has led to a number of theories. Some believe the perpetrator may have left the area, been incarcerated for another crime, or even died, which could explain the absence of further incidents. Others have speculated if the eastward positioning of the bodies was symbolic. Certain types of serial slayers believe they are on some sort of mission, generally to rid the world of what they view as quote-unquote corruption. The pointing of the victims toward the neon glow of the casinos has been suggested to cast blame on Atlantic City's vice-based industries. Others have speculated that it had some sort of ritual or occult significance, since they were all pointed towards the sunrise in what could be argued to be a ritualistic manner. These ideas, of course, remain entirely conjecture, without hard proof or even circumstantial evidence. Picture a quiet evening in a Russian pharmacy. Customers are browsing the aisles and everything seems ordinary. Suddenly, a man walks in wearing a medical mask and a baseball cap, carrying a black plastic bag. Without warning, he pulls a sawed-off shotgun from the bag and fires into the store. Chaos erupts. People scream and scramble for cover as the gunman briefly steps back outside to reload. Moments later, he returns and calmly shoots an injured customer again at point-blank range before vanishing into the city streets. This isn't a movie scene, but a real crime from 2011. The unknown perpetrator would later be dubbed the Pharmacy Maniac by the press. The Pharmacy Maniac's first known attack took place on May 26, 2011. In the late afternoon, a young man in a surgical mask and cap walked into a Classica pharmacy on a busy central street in Chelyabinsk. He was carrying a plastic bag that concealed a sawed-off shotgun. Inside the store were several employees and customers going about their day. The masked intruder suddenly pointed the shotgun and demanded the equivalent of $2,000 from those present, threatening to shoot anyone who didn't cooperate. Panicked, the people began handing over cash and valuables. As this robbery unfolded, 49-year-old Vladimir Shin walked into the pharmacy, unaware of the danger. Shin was simply stopping by to pick up some medicine on his way home. The armed man yelled at him to stop, and when Shin tried to back out of the doorway, the gunman shot him in the chest, slaying him on the spot. In the commotion, some witnesses escaped out a back door, while the shooter fled through the front, disappearing into nearby alleyways before police could arrive. The whole incident lasted only minutes, leaving one innocent man dead and a community in shock. For several weeks, the pharmacy shooting appeared to be an isolated incident, a botched armed robbery with a tragic outcome. But on August 10th, 2011, the predator struck again, and this time it was clear that he wasn't just your usual armed robber. Around 5:30 p.m., a man with a similar disguise walked into another Classica pharmacy near the site of the first attack. Without saying a word, he immediately opened fire on a customer near the entrance, 30-year-old Igor Ustinov, who had just briefly stopped in to grab a prescription. Igor fell to the floor wounded, and other patrons ran or hid in terror. The attacker didn't take any money from the register or make any demands. He simply fired another round into the store and stepped back outside. In that moment, we can speculate that Ustinov likely thought the worst of his nightmare was over. Unfortunately, this couldn't be further from the truth. Incredibly, the maniac then re-entered the pharmacy after a brief pause. As panicked onlookers cowered, the shooter walked up to the injured Ustinov and shot him in the head multiple times. According to some witnesses, the attacker muttered that it was, quote, "all your fault," and kept referring to the pharmacy staff as white coats. He slipped away into the streets just as effortlessly as he had the first time. Security cameras captured the suspect leaving the scene, and police later traced his path through side streets, but they lost his trail about a mile away from the pharmacy. Despite dozens of eyewitnesses and footage of the crime, the mysterious shooter once again vanished without a trace. After this second attack, it became clear that Chelyabinsk had a serial predator targeting local pharmacies. The media branded the unknown assailant the pharmacy maniac, and fear spread through the city. For a time, some residents were even afraid to visit pharmacies for basic medicines, not knowing if the maniac would strike again. Law enforcement launched a massive manhunt, and the Classica pharmacy chain, the specific target in both cases, was put under special protection by the cops. Investigators collected descriptions from witnesses and released a composite sketch of the suspect, described as a light-haired man in his late 20s to mid-30s, of average build. He was often seen wearing a dark baseball cap and glasses, and the police plastered this sketch on public transportation, in shop windows, and across the city. Authorities also posted a 1 million ruble reward for information leading to the capture of the pharmacy maniac. For investigators, there were some clues, but also frustrating gaps. Ballistic tests confirmed that the same sawed-off weapon was used in both events, proving the attacks were linked. However, the weapon itself offered little insight. It was a common model used for hunting that had been illegally modified, making it impossible to trace ownership. The surveillance footage, while chilling, didn't reveal the shooter's face due to his cap and mask. Witnesses noted that during the second attack, the gunman looked unusually sickly, with a yellowish complexion and sores on his hands. Police checked local hospitals, hunted for anyone with relevant military experience, and even considered that the perpetrator might have fled the region or the country. Despite a thorough investigation that continued for years, the pharmacy maniac was never caught. With the case unsolved, many theories arose about the pharmacy maniac's identity and motive. One theory is that these were simply robberies gone wrong. In the first incident, the attacker clearly demanded cash and valuables, suggesting his goal was theft. Under this theory, the maniac might have been an ordinary criminal, driven by greed, who panicked when a customer entered into the ongoing crime scene. The second attack, however, complicates the robbery motive, as that time the assailant didn't even try to steal anything before opening fire. Some investigators thought the shooter might have had a personal grudge against the Classica pharmacy chain or the medical community. The fact that he targeted the same brand of pharmacy in the same area hinted at a possible vendetta. Notably, he did call the pharmacy workers white coats, which suggests that he may have been using this as a derogatory term towards healthcare workers. However, these theories also have significant holes. The attacker didn't actually physically harm any employees of Classica, which would be unusual if he was intending to attack healthcare workers. Further, if a vendetta against the Classica pharmacy chain was at play, he could have made his intentions much more specific or released a manifesto. Another line of thought focuses on the attacker's psychological state. The pharmacy maniac's actions were extraordinarily violent, and he was clearly acting in a way that can't possibly be rationalized. Some experts profiled him as someone who might be suffering from a psychotic break, perhaps brought on by substance usage. The suspect's disheveled, sickly appearance with jaundiced skin and sores further fueled speculation that he might have been an addict. Under this scenario, the attacks might have been the result of paranoia or rage from an unstable individual rather than a calculated plan. Over a decade later, the pharmacy maniac case remains unsolved and continues to haunt the residents of Chelyabinsk. Even now, some residents of the city reportedly maintain a state of high alert while entering pharmacies, indicating the collective damage he did to the psyche of the people there. Imagine you're a traveler in southeastern Kansas in the early 1870s. The country still has the fresh scars of conflict and the promise of a new life, of 160 acres to call your own, has pulled you west. The landscape around you is an immense, unforgiving prairie. It's a lonely expanse where homesteads are scattered like islands in a sea of grass, and your nearest neighbor might be miles away. This is Labette County, a place carved out of land recently ceded by the Osage Nation, a place defined by both boundless opportunity and profound isolation. Your journey follows the Great Osage Trail, a path worn into the earth first by migrating buffalo, then by Native American tribes, and now by the wagons of settlers like yourself. It's a vital artery of westward expansion, but it's also a place of great danger. The weather is harsh and unpredictable, with tornadoes, blizzards, and floods that can erase a homesteader's dreams overnight. Violence is a constant threat, whether from conflicts with displaced tribes or from the battle-hardened American men who now work their way onto the frontier. In this vast emptiness, people simply vanish, and when they disappear, the prairie keeps their secrets. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows across the plains, you spot a light. It comes from a small one-room cabin, a welcome sign of life in the desolate landscape. A crude hand-lettered sign above the door reads, "Groceries." This is the Bender Place, a wayside inn offering the promise of a hot meal, supplies, and most importantly, a safe place to rest for the night. For a weary traveler, it seems like a sanctuary, a fragile outpost of civilization where the unspoken code of frontier hospitality offers a moment of peace. You approach, unaware that the trust you're about to place in these strangers is the last mistake you'll ever make. This humble cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a slaughterhouse, and for at least a dozen travelers, this beacon of hope on this great migratory trail was the end of the line. This is the disturbing story of the Benders, a supposed family of innkeepers who committed horrific actions before performing one of American history's greatest vanishing acts. To understand the horror that unfolded in Labette County, one must first try to understand the perpetrators. But the Bender family itself is an enigma, a collection of 4 individuals whose true identities, origins, and relationships remain a mystery. They presented themselves as a simple homesteading family, but they were a carefully constructed criminal conspiracy, a human machine where each member played a specific and deadly role. The patriarch, John Bender Sr., was a man of about 60, described by those who met him as a repulsive and brutish figure. He was a giant of a man, with piercing eyes and a sullen, ill-tempered demeanor. Like the other members of this so-called family, he claimed to be from Germany. As with all the members of the family, it remains unclear what their true origins were, as German was commonly spoken across Central and Eastern Europe. And to get in my one mandatory Simpsons reference per video, no one who speaks German could be an evil man, right? His wife, Elvira Bender, was around 55 and equally disliked by her neighbors, who called her a she-devil. Unfriendly and sinister, she was rumored to have slain previous husbands before arriving in Kansas, and she dabbled in folk magic, claiming to be a medium who could cast spells. While she claimed not to understand English, a moment of rage during a confrontation later revealed her command of the language was far better than she let on. The younger generation presented a stark contrast. John Bender Jr., about 25, was handsome and spoke English well, though with a German accent. He had a peculiar habit of laughing without cause, which led many in the community to suspect there was something wrong with him. This perception, whether genuine or an act, made him seem harmless and non-threatening, a perfect disguise for the violence he was capable of. The public face and undisputed star of the operation was Kate Bender. Around 23 years old, she was universally described as beautiful, intelligent, and intensely charismatic. She was fluent in English and was the only member of the family who actively engaged with the surrounding community. Kate was the family's lure, and her chosen bait was spiritualism. In an era when communicating with the dead was a popular and widespread belief, Kate advertised herself as a powerful psychic, healer, and spiritualist medium. She distributed flyers and gave lectures, claiming she could cure blindness and deafness with the laying on of hands, contact the spirits of the deceased, and locate lost possessions. Her lectures also promoted radical ideas like free love, which, while scandalous, only added to her notoriety and drew curious visitors to the family inn. And by curious travelers, I mean men traveling alone who definitely thought they had a chance with this frontier cutie. Kate's persona was the perfect tool for disarming travelers, and she was basically the honeypot that lured victims in. With her charm and supposed supernatural gifts, she could win their trust. This would draw them into intimate conversations where they would reveal their travel plans and, most importantly, their financial situations. The very foundation of this group was built on lies. While they were widely believed to be German immigrants, no official documentation of their origins, or even their real names, has ever been discovered. The name Bender itself, while a fairly common German name, was almost certainly an alias. Even their family ties were likely a complete fabrication. Neighbors reported that the intimacy between John Jr. and Kate seemed more like that of a husband and wife than siblings. The reason for doing this was also a part of their ruse. In a society built on the family unit, the image of a family-run inn offered a veneer of safety and respectability that was crucial to their predatory success. The Benders' genius for evil was not just in their deception, but in their engineering. They transformed their humble, one-room cabin into a highly efficient machine capable of quote-unquote processing guests. The cabin was a simple wooden structure measuring about 16 by 24 feet. Inside, they had made a simple but critical modification. A large, heavy canvas wagon cover was hung from a rope, splitting the single room in two. The front area was the public face of their operation, a small general store and a dining room where travelers could get a meal. The area behind the curtain was the family's private quarters, but its true purpose was to serve as a blind from which to launch their ambush. Their modus operandi was a chillingly refined process. After Kate identified a suitable victim, usually a man traveling alone with significant money, he would be invited to dinner and given the seat of honor at the table. This seat wasn't a gesture of hospitality, it was a tactical position. It placed the guest with his back directly against the canvas partition, perfectly silhouetting his head for the attacker waiting behind it. As the unsuspecting traveler ate his meal, captivated by Kate's charm and conversation, one of the male benders would slip behind the curtain. At the right moment, the attacker would swing a heavy hammer, striking the victim on the back of the head with crushing force. Beneath the victim's chair, or immediately beside it, was a concealed trapdoor. The stunned or dead man was immediately dropped through the opening into a dark, stone-lined cellar that was 6 feet deep. This allowed for the instant removal of the body from the main room, minimizing mess and the risk of discovery should another guest arrive. The body was then stripped of every valuable before being disposed of. Under the cover of night, the bodies were removed from this subterranean abattoir and buried in the family's 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard just north of the cabin. In a particularly macabre detail passed down through local lore, it was said that Elvira Bender used the apples from the trees growing over her victims' graves to bake pies for future travelers. The Benders' reign of terror lasted for nearly 2 years, from May 1871 to the spring of 1873. During that time, they eliminated at least a dozen people, though the true number may be much higher. Their victims were the forgotten travelers of the frontier, men whose disappearances created distant ripples of concern, but no organized alarm until it was far too late. After all, Kate was an expert at finding men who were very far from home, and whose disappearances wouldn't be noticed for months or even years. The case that finally brought an end to the Benders' slaughter began with the disappearance of George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann in the winter of 1872. A recent widower, Longcore was traveling back to Iowa and was carrying a significant sum of money. When they vanished, Longcore's former neighbor from Independence, a physician named Dr. William York, became concerned and set out to find them in the spring of 1873. Dr. York's search led him along the Osage Trail and inevitably to the Bender Inn, where he, too, disappeared. The attack on Dr. York was the Benders' final overreach. For 2 years, they had preyed on the anonymous and the transient, individuals whose disappearances could be easily dismissed. Dr. York, however, was a prominent man, and more importantly, his brother was Colonel Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. Unlike the families of other victims, Colonel York had the influence, resources, and unwavering determination to mobilize a search and demand answers. In March 1873, Colonel Alexander York arrived at the Benders Inn, methodically retracing his brother's last known movements. During his initial questioning, the family deployed their well-practiced deception. They admitted Dr. York had stopped there, but insisted he'd continued on his way. They casually suggested he might have fallen victim to an attack by a local tribe or by highwaymen, common and convenient explanations for such disappearances. Kate, the master manipulator, pretended to be deeply concerned and offered to hold a seance to contact his spirit, telling the colonel to return another day. She let him know that he needed to come back alone, in what was a brazen attempt to make the investigator their next victim. But Colonel York was not easily fooled, and he sensed a profound evil in the small cabin and left, deeply suspicious. His doubts were confirmed when he learned of another traveler, a woman who had recently fled the inn in terror after Elvira threatened her with a knife. York returned, this time with an armed posse of men that definitely weren't clowning around. The confrontation was tense, and Elvira's subsequent explosion of rage shattered her facade as a simple woman who couldn't speak English. This outburst further solidified Colonel York's conviction that the family was hiding a dark secret, but in the end, nothing happened yet. As York's investigation intensified, the wider community, already on edge from the string of disappearances, reached a breaking point. A town meeting was convened where dozens of local men gathered to decide on a course of action. They resolved to obtain a warrant and conduct a search of every single homestead in the township. In an act of astonishing audacity, the Bender men were also present at that meeting. They sat among their neighbors, listening as the community organized the very search that would inevitably unearth the bodies buried in their own garden. It was a final, desperate gamble to appear innocent, an attempt to deflect suspicion that was doomed to fail. The Benders knew the moment the vote was taken that their time was up. They could perhaps deceive a lone questioner, but they couldn't survive a systematic, official search of their property. Sometime in the days following the meeting, under the cover of the vast Kansas night, they packed what they could, abandoned their homestead, and vanished. Their escape was discovered a few days later when a neighbor noticed their farm animals were starving and the inn was eerily silent. Unfortunately, a spell of bad weather delayed a formal investigation, giving the Benders a crucial head start of nearly a month to disappear into the American frontier. When the search party finally forced their way into the abandoned Bender cabin in early May 1873, they were met with a scene of hurried departure and an overpowering stench of death. The source of the odor was quickly traced to a trap door under a bed, which had been nailed shut. After prying it open, they peered down into the stone-lined cellar. The pit was empty of bodies, but the floor was caked with so much clotted blood that it had soaked deep into the earth below, irrefutable proof that this had been a place of slaughter. The search then moved outside to the family's small apple orchard and vegetable garden. The ground in the orchard was soft and appeared to have been recently disturbed. The men began to probe the soil, and it wasn't long before they made their first horrific discovery, the body of Dr. William York, buried in a shallow grave. The news spread, and a full-scale excavation began. Over the next day, the searchers unearthed a graveyard. One by one, they uncovered the remains of at least 10 more people, including George Longcore and his infant daughter. The story of the Benders' House of Horrors became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago sent reporters to the remote Kansas prairie, and their lurid accounts of the Devil's Kitchen captivated the public. These accounts took the already horrific realities and added new fictionalized elements in an effort to sell more papers. After fleeing their farm, the Benders' trail quickly went cold. Investigators found their abandoned wagon near the town of Thayer, just 12 miles to the north. But from there, the trail vanished completely. A massive manhunt was launched, and the Kansas governor offered a $2,000 reward, a fortune at the time, for information leading to their capture. What happened to the Benders remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Old West, a narrative vacuum that has been filled with two powerful and competing theories. The first is that they simply got away. In the vast, unmapped expanse of 19th century America, it was entirely possible for 4 people to change their names, split up, and begin new lives without a trace. This theory is bolstered by the numerous false sightings and wrongful arrests that plagued investigators for decades. In 1880, a couple in Nebraska was arrested and even confessed, but they were soon exposed as imposters. In 1889, 2 women were arrested in Michigan and extradited to Kansas on suspicion of being Elvira and Kate, only to be exonerated when their alibis proved solid. These incidents reflect a public desperate for closure, but they also highlight how easily the fugitives could have blended back into society, either in America or elsewhere. The second, more pervasive theory is that the Benders met a swift and brutal end at the hands of a vigilante posse. According to this version of events, a group of enraged neighbors caught up with the family shortly after they fled. They dispensed their own form of frontier justice, forcing confessions from the Benders before eliminating them. While no physical evidence supports this story, it aligns with the harsh realities of the frontier, where communities often took the law into their own hands when official channels failed. The secrecy of such an extrajudicial act would neatly explain why no one ever came forward to claim the substantial reward. Today, more than 150 years later, the search for answers continues, and who the Benders were and what happened to them remains a historical, unsolved mystery. Between 1975 and 1989, 7 females ranging from an 11-year-old girl to a 50-year-old woman were slain within a 20-kilometer radius in Japan's Saga Prefecture. The perpetrator, never identified, became known as the Wednesday Strangler because 6 of the 7 victims disappeared on a Wednesday. Investigators noted other common patterns across the acts. All the disappearances occurred in the evening or at night, and the 5 of the victims for whom the cause of death could be analyzed were confirmed to have died by strangulation. Further yet, most victims showed signs of indecent assault, suggesting a motive for the perp. These similarities convinced police that the incidents were connected and the work of a serial predator operating in the rural Saga region. The series of attacks began in the mid-1970s and unfolded sporadically over 14 years. The first known victim was Tomiko Yamasaki, a 12-year-old girl who vanished from her home in Kitagata on August 27, 1975. Tomiko was home alone that evening. A friend had visited and left around 7 p.m., after which the girl mysteriously disappeared. Her mother returned that night. The television was still on, and Tomiko's shoes were by the door, but the girl was gone. She remained missing for nearly 5 years, until June 27, 1980, when her skeletal remains were discovered hidden in a septic tank by the swimming pool of a local elementary school. Only days before Tomiko's body was found, police had made another gruesome discovery at the same school. On June 24, 1980, the decomposed body of 19-year-old Ritsuko Hayakutake was found in a septic tank at that same school. Ritsuko, a young local woman, had disappeared on April 12, 1980, under similar circumstances after spending the night home alone. In the weeks after Ritsuko's disappearance, her family received a taunting letter written in an old-fashioned Japanese script. One line read that their daughter, quote, "isn't coming back," and another read, quote, "I hope you suffer." Notably, these letters were never proven to be from anyone related to the case. They also got a series of phone calls from a young-sounding man who warned them not to publicize Ritsuko's case or cooperate further with authorities. The discovery of Ritsuko's body, and then Tomiko's in the exact same location 3 days later, made it clear the two cases were linked. The next victim was Chizuko Ikegami, a 27-year-old factory employee from Shiroishi. On October 7, 1981, a Wednesday, Chizuko left her garment factory job and never returned home. About 2 weeks later, her body was found in a vacant lot in a nearby city. She had been strangled with an electrical power cord that was still wrapped around her neck. Just 4 months after Chizuko's slaying, an even younger victim was claimed. On February 17, 1982, Kumi Nishiyama, an 11-year-old elementary school student, was walking home when she was abducted. She had parted ways with her friends only minutes before the kidnappers struck. Kumi's body was found the next morning, stuffed inside a bag and left in a grove of trees near her school. It was estimated she was slain within 10 minutes of being taken. Several witnesses later reported seeing a suspicious middle-aged man in a white car cruising around the area that day. This man had allegedly tried to lure a woman at a bus stop into his car. This woman refused and threatened to call police. He was also seen approaching groups of school children, with some children reporting that he was offering rides, and others saying that he wanted to show them pictures. In fact, on that same afternoon, a man in a white car briefly kidnapped another young girl, releasing her only when she began crying loudly. Witnesses provided police with a partial license plate number and a description of the vehicle and driver. Unsurprisingly, the vehicle was noted to be a white sedan, very strongly suggesting the same man was responsible. Despite these leads, the man in the white car was never identified. After 1982, the perpetrator again went dormant for several years. Also, you may be wondering right now how the authorities still believe these cases are all related, but I'll be getting to that shortly. And to tip my hand more than a little bit, I'm in the camp that this was definitely carried out by multiple unrelated perpetrators, and you're about to see why. The case had grown cold when 5 years later, the violence began anew. On July 8, 1987, Sumiko Fujise, a 48-year-old restaurant worker from Takeo, left work early to go out with colleagues. After an hour together, her friends invited Sumiko to continue hanging out, but she declined and headed off on her own. Sumiko never made it home that night and was soon reported missing. About a year and a half later, on December 7, 1988, Kiyomi Nakajima, a 50-year-old housewife from Kitagata, also vanished under mysterious circumstances. Kiyomi had left her house that evening to attend a weekly volleyball practice at a local sports center less than a mile away, but she never arrived. A local resident had seen her speaking with a man on a bicycle shortly before she disappeared. 2 weeks into the search for Kiyomi, her husband received a strange phone call at home. An unidentified man claimed that Kiyomi had been found near a mountain pass. The caller hinted that he was someone the family knew, but he refused to give his name or specific details of Kiyomi's whereabouts. Kiyomi's husband recorded the strange phone message, but police were ultimately unable to trace the caller. Both Kiyomi's home and her husband's workplace began receiving repeated silent calls afterward, possibly from the same person. The final victim in this series was Tatsuyo Tatsu, a 37-year-old office worker from Kitagata. On January 25, 1989, again a Wednesday, Tatsuyo spoke with someone on the phone in the early evening, then told her mother she was going out to help a friend. She left the house and never returned. Later that same night, Tatsuyo's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a local bowling alley. A co-worker came forward to report that she had seen Tatsuyo getting into a white Toyota sedan with an unknown person that evening. This disappearance immediately set off an intensive search, but it ended in grim fashion just 2 days later, and the results would spark a massive media firestorm. On January 27, 1989, a couple driving through a wooded area in the mountains of Kitagata pulled over so the wife could gather flowers. As she walked near the base of a cliff, she stumbled upon the dead body of a woman and immediately called police. When authorities arrived and searched the area, they discovered 2 more female bodies sprawled at the bottom of the same rocky slope, about 6 feet apart from each other. Personal items and clothing belonging to the victims were found scattered in the underbrush over the area, suggesting the perp had dumped the victims and their belongings from atop the cliff. The 3 bodies were soon identified as those of Sumiko Fujise, Kiyomi Nakajima, and Tatsuyo Yoshino, the missing women from 1987 to 1989. Forensic examination determined that Kiyomi and Tatsuyo had each been strangled, while Sumiko's remains were skeletal and the cause couldn't be made out. This finding sparked a massive media sensation and also marked the end of the slayings. The discovery of 3 bodies together in January 1989 dramatically re-energized the investigation. Given that Sumiko, Kiyomi, and Tatsuyo were all dumped at the same site, police now had confirmation that a single perpetrator was behind those 3 acts. Attention quickly turned to Teruhiko Matsue, a 26-year-old man from Kitagata who had known Tatsuyo personally. Matsue was acquainted with Tatsuyo through work and was one of the last people to call her before she disappeared. In fact, immediately after the 1989 cliffside discoveries, Matsue was briefly detained and questioned because of his link to Tatsuyo. During an intensive interrogation, he seemed to suggest his involvement. However, he quickly recanted anything that could be taken as a confession, claiming he had been coerced, and he provided an alibi. He said that he was out with friends on the night Tatsuyo was slain. At that time, with no physical evidence or eyewitness testimony implicating him, the police let him go free. For more than a decade after 1989, the Wednesday Strangler case saw little progress. It wasn't until the early 2000s that investigators revisited Teruhiko Matsue as a suspect for the 1987 to 1989 triple slayings only. By 2002, Matsue was serving a short prison sentence for an unrelated burglary conviction, when new evidence and the looming expiration of the statute of limitations prompted police to act. On June 11, 2002, Saga Prefectural Police rearrested Teruhiko Matsue in his cell and formally charged him with 3 of the serial slayings. Notably, the 15-year statute of limitations had already expired on the first 4 slayings. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying Matsue as a cold-blooded serial strangler who preyed on women and dumped their bodies in the mountains. Matsue's trial opened in October 2002 in Saga District Court, and he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case against him was largely circumstantial. The prosecution's evidence included his past alleged confession and some potential forensic traces. Matsue's defense argued that the incriminating statements he gave were coerced by an aggressive police interrogation and that the DNA evidence wasn't conclusive. In fact, when a further mitochondrial DNA test was conducted on materials from the crime scene, the results didn't link Matsue at all, which was highly problematic to the case against him. Also, I feel it necessary to mention that this sort of evidence should have been considered a good thing for the prosecution. It let them know that they didn't have their man, but perhaps because the statute of limitations had expired, they just kept up the prosecution despite obvious exculpatory evidence. Ultimately, in 2005, after significant delays, the court found the case against Matsue lacking, and all charges against him were dismissed. The court wasn't kind to how investigators handled the case, to put it mildly. The court found that he had been coerced into his pseudo-confession. Also, given the way Japanese cops handle interrogations, when a Japanese court finds that an accused was coerced, that's pretty damning. This verdict was a shocking disappointment for the police and prosecutors, who immediately appealed. The saga finally came to a close in March 2007. The Fukuoka High Court upheld the not guilty verdict on appeal, meaning he was once again cleared of all charges. In its ruling, the High Court agreed that there was no direct evidence tying Matsue to the crimes, and it criticized the investigation's sloppy methods. To date, all 7 slayings remain officially unsolved. By the time Matsue was cleared, the statute of limitations for all cases had expired. Notably, in 2010, partly spurred by cases like this, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for serious offenses, but that change was not retroactive. Even if the Wednesday Strangler was to go public today, there would be nothing to do. Over the years, the Wednesday Strangler case has prompted extensive media coverage and countless theories. Some observers have argued that multiple perpetrators could have been responsible for these 7 slayings. They point out that the victims didn't all fit one profile. 2 of the victims were just 11 and 12. 2 of the other victims were women in their very early adulthood. The last 3 victims, spanning from 1987 to 1989, on the other hand, were middle-aged women. Serial predators often prefer a specific victim type or age range, which raises the possibility that the acts were committed by at least 2 different criminals operating at different times. This theory generally suggests that 3 or more perpetrators were involved, and that most of the links are simple coincidences. That said, there are still many who believe that given all these coincidences, this was all the work of one man. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that DNA evidence was preserved from the earlier victims, and unless the perpetrator comes out and confesses, it seems unlikely we'll ever have answers. In the summer of 1911, on a warm Saturday night in Atlanta, Georgia, a young woman named Emma Lou Sharp went out to look for her missing mother. 20-year-old Emma Lou was worried as she walked the dark streets, knowing a dangerous menace lurked in the city's black neighborhoods. Sure enough, a tall, broad-shouldered stranger in a wide-brimmed hat appeared out of the darkness. He spoke calmly and told Emma Lou she had nothing to fear. He didn't harm girls like her. Then, in an instant, the man lunged and stabbed her in the back before disappearing into the night. Bleeding and terrified, Emma Lou managed to stagger away and survive. But not far from where she was attacked, her mother, 40-year-old Lena Sharp, lay dead. Her throat cut so deeply that she was nearly beheaded. Atlanta had a serial predator on its hands, one so brutal and elusive that the press would soon dub him the Atlanta Ripper. Atlanta in 1911 was a booming southern city proudly advertising itself as the capital of the New South, and effectively the business capital of the South. Notably, black-owned businesses and colleges catering to black students were growing at a rapid pace. But for most black residents, life was harsh and segregated. Many members of the black community in the city were also recent arrivals from rural regions and were far away from their family and the rest of their social connections. In this fraught atmosphere, crimes against black people often didn't receive meaningful attention from the authorities or media. The first slaying that drew notice occurred on May 28, 1911, when a woman named Belle Walker failed to return home from her job as a cook. Her body was found the next morning near her house, her throat slashed by an unknown assailant. The gruesome slaying got only a brief mention in the city's newspapers. 2 weeks later, on June 15th, another black woman was brutally attacked. 22-year-old Addie Watts was struck in the head with a brick and left in some bushes with her throat cut. This second attack in such a short span set off alarm bells, and a local paper published a story claiming there was a, quote, butcher stalking the streets. The article claimed a, quote, insane criminal might be prowling the city and drew a direct comparison to Jack the Ripper. The idea seemed implausible at the time, but as more victims surfaced, it began to seem more likely. Over the next several weeks, one Saturday night after another brought news of another slain woman. Nearly every victim fit a pattern. Young black or mixed-race women, often in their early 20s, attacked while walking alone at night. Each was found with her throat viciously slashed, and some victims' bodies showed signs of horrific mutilation. By early July 1911, at least 8 women had been slain in this manner. The attack on Emma Lou Sharp and her mother Lena on July 1st, 1911, finally convinced even the skeptics that a serial predator was likely on the loose. Newspapers that had earlier downplayed the crimes now featured them prominently, perhaps in hopes of using lurid stories to sell more papers. Significant pressure on the police mounted as prominent, wealthy white families exerted pressure on them to solve the case. These families weren't necessarily upset about the crime spree, but rather the fact that their black female employees started to leave work early or refused to show up at night. Regardless of this apparent lack of altruism or genuine concern, they were able to pressure the authorities into taking the case very seriously. However, as I'll explain shortly, this pressure may have simply led to the cops attempting to close out the file, so to speak. On July 11, 1911, just 10 days after the Sharp incident, the body of another victim, 25-year-old Sadie Holly, was discovered beside a streetcar line. The local papers weren't even sure how to number this attack. Depending on the source, Sadie was either the 7th, 8th, or 9th victim attributed to the Ripper. What was clear was that the perpetrator was growing bolder, and the city's outrage was growing with each new body that was found. Under tremendous pressure, the police ramped up their efforts. Within a day of Sadie Holly's slaying, they arrested a 27-year-old black laborer named Henry Huff. Huff had reportedly been seen with Sadie on the night of her death, and when picked up he was found wearing bloody clothes and bearing scratch marks on his arms. The arrest was splashed across headlines, and for a moment it seemed the nightmare might be over. However, the case against Huff was weak, and he was held only on suspicion, and investigators admitted they lacked solid evidence tying him to the string of attacks. Soon after Huff's arrest, another suspect was caught. A tip led police to 35-year-old Todd Henderson. Henderson, like Huff, had been seen around the area of one of the slayings. The police brought Emma Lou Sharp to the station to see if she could identify Henderson as the man who attacked her. Emma Lou was startled by Henderson's voice and thought he might be the same man, but she couldn't be absolutely certain. That lingering doubt meant Henderson couldn't be definitively pinned as the perpetrator. Henderson didn't do himself any favors. He made an off-color remark that if he were Jack the Ripper, he would have eliminated his own wife first. The police ended up presenting both Huff and Henderson to a grand jury, essentially hoping the jurors might decide whom to indict for the slaying of Sadie Holly. Throughout August 1911, with Huff and Henderson locked up, the attacks unfortunately continued. In late August, another young woman was found with her throat cut in a rail yard on Atlanta's west side. Then in November 1911, 15-year-old Minnie Wise was discovered slain in an alley in the style of the Atlanta Ripper. These attacks occurred while the two main suspects were behind bars, suggesting that neither Huff nor Henderson was the true Ripper unless a copycat was at play. Both men were eventually released without charge. In early 1912, with the investigation stalling, some authorities floated alternative theories. A Fulton County grand jury concluded that the so-called Atlanta Ripper might be a myth. They speculated that each attack could have been an unrelated act of violence by different men, but many Atlantans doubted this explanation. The consistency in the crimes, the uncanny similarities in how, when, and against whom they were carried out, was hard to dismiss. To the community and many officers, it still looked like the work of a single madman. Leads continued to trickle in, and in April 1912, a man named Charlie Owens was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for one of the attacks attributed to the Ripper. It was never clearly reported which victim's case this was, and the secretive way the trial was handled left observers puzzled. Whatever the truth, Owens's imprisonment didn't halt the attacks that newspapers linked to the Ripper. That summer, police arrested yet another suspect, Lawton Brown. Brown's wife had gone to the police with a disturbing story. She said that on several Saturday nights matching the attack dates, her husband came home late with blood on his clothes. Under interrogation, Brown reportedly confessed to at least one attack and hinted at knowing about the others. It seemed like a breakthrough, but the manner of the confession raised red flags. In court, it came out that detectives had beaten Brown severely to extract his confession. Brown recanted, claiming he was coerced, and he was acquitted in October 1912 when a jury found the case against him unconvincing. Once again, Atlanta was back to square one. By 1913, the panic had begun to subside a little, perhaps out of fatigue and the lower frequency of new attacks, but the mystery was far from solved. In March 1913, the slaying of yet another young black woman, Laura Smith, made the papers, and she was noted as possibly the third victim of the Ripper that year. In early 1914, a chilling development revived all the old fears. Handwritten notes were found pinned to emergency call boxes around the city, warning that the Ripper would start attacking younger black women caught out at night. Soon after, several more women were attacked and slain in familiar fashion, bringing the total toll attributed to the Atlanta Ripper to somewhere around 20 victims in all. And then, as mysteriously as it all began, the attack stopped and never resumed. After 1914, no more slayings were linked to the Ripper's spree. The nightmare that had terrorized Atlanta for 3 or 4 years simply evaporated without any satisfactory conclusion. Over a century has passed, and the Atlanta Ripper case remains unsolved. No single suspect was ever definitively identified as the perpetrator, and no one was convicted for the majority of the attacks. After the attack stopped, the authorities rapidly lost interest in wrapping up the investigation, and the case went cold. Contemporary analysis has strongly considered that the Atlanta Ripper might not have been a lone wolf at all. It's possible that multiple perpetrators used the Ripper's brutal methods as a cover for their crimes. Some have suggested it could have been a group that actually communicated and conspired with one another. Others have suggested that as the hysteria built, copycats could simply employ the widely known methods of the Ripper to provide cover for their crimes. Under this theory, these individuals may have simply used it as a cover to attack those close to them without the usual scrutiny that would bring. Others maintain it truly was one man who vanished from Atlanta by 1915, explaining why the attacks ceased so suddenly. Ultimately, the truth of this case is unlikely to ever be known.